Hello everybody, Terreno here, and today I'm going to talk a little bit more about Hungarian tanks. In my last video I looked at how Hungarian tanks should be implemented. In this video I will look more in depth at what Hungarian tanks and vehicles can be implemented. This list is mostly based off the subtree I produced for the last video, which includes all major variants and models. Also, a shout out to Lex the Mystic for pointing out in the comments of the last video that some of the vehicles on this list have already been data mined in the game's files, suggesting work has already been done on some of these vehicles, which can only be a good sign. So without further ado, let's have a look at some Hungarian tanks. Now we're going to start off with a Hungarian armoured car, the 39M Csaba. Now this, along with the V4 light tank, was designed by Nicholas Strausler, a Hungarian engineer who is nowadays mainly remembered for this. No, he wasn't the designer of the Sherman tank, but in fact the flotation devices used on the duplex drive or floating Sherman tanks as used on D-Day. But before this he designed the more conventional 39M Csaba, based off of previous designs offered to and turned down by the British Army. The Csaba was armed with the 36M Nehe Pushka, a Hungarian-produced version of the 20mm Solothurn S18-100 anti-tank rifle, with a penetration of 20mm at a 30-degree angle, as well as a coaxial rear hatch-mounted machine gun. Armour was thin at 9mm, and its crew complement of 3 consisted of a driver, commander and gunner. As expected of an armoured car, it has a high speed of around 65 km an hour, or 40 miles per hour. With its small caliber gun and thin armour, it is more likely to find success in shoot and scoot situations, or as recon for more capable tanks rather than in straight up fights. Overall, this vehicle should be added into War Thunder at a battle rating of 1.0, or even as a reserve vehicle if deemed necessary. Moving on, we come to the Hungarian light tanks, starting off with the V4 tank, alternatively called the Light Tank V4 or Strausler V4. The last in a line of prototypes, this was again designed by Nicholas Strausler, and in a hint of what was to come in the future, the V4 was supposed to be amphibious, though at this time it was only with pontoons, something it would be unlikely to be fitted with in War Thunder, instead being added as a regular tank. For a 1937 design it was pretty good, with a 37M 40mm gun and 2 coaxial machine guns, maximum of 26mm of armour, max speed of 40 km an hour or 25 miles per hour on tracks, as this could also run on just the wheels if required, and a crew of 4. The 37M 40mm is what the 37/42M already in game was based off of. So although I haven't found any exact stats, I think it's safe to say that presumably it should have slightly worse stats than the gun already in game. But even so, this would give it some pretty good penetration characteristics, which would allow it to do pretty well killing at a distance where its armour will be less of a disadvantage. When added to War Thunder, I think it should be added at a battle rating of 1 to 1.3 on account of its gun, an act that ironically will place it higher than the tanks that were chosen instead of it to be placed in production. Indeed, there are arguments for saying this should probably be included on the subtree after the Toy-D 1/2, and just before or after the 2A, although this may cause some confusion, as indeed these were the tanks that were supposed to replace it. We will now look at those chosen tanks, and why I feel the V4 is in many ways superior. The first of these is the 39M Toy-D 1, a licence-produced version of Landsverke's L60, with a few minor modifications, mainly to do with the armament. The Toy-D 1 has 6 to 13mm of armour, a max speed of 50 km an hour or 31 miles per hour, and a crew of 3, a driver in the hull and commander and gunner in the turret. However, the Hungarians chose to remove the 20mm Madsen autocannon and instead replace it with the 36M 20mm, the same anti-tank rifle as on the Csaba. Now, the main problem with this is that while the penetration isn't completely awful, the weapon itself is semi-automatic and fed from 4 or 5 round box magazines, meaning you'll be outshot by any enemies with fast autocannons, while tanks with slower firing guns will likely have the armour to withstand your weapon, while your own armour will provide almost no protection. This just seems such a step down from the original Madsen 20mm, which would likely have been better in the anti-tank and anti-infantry role, but presumably Hungary didn't want to be producing and supply another gun and its accompanying ammunition, which would further strain its logistics and industry. They would also have to refit the turret to fit the V4's 40mm gun, which would likely have taken up too much time. Surprisingly, the choice of radio antenna could also be a problem, as it is quite large and sticks up quite a way above the Tawldy one, possibly giving away your position when hiding behind cover. Overall, the choice of armament and thin armour seriously limits the capabilities of this vehicle, leaving me with no choice but to place it at Reserve or Battle Rating 1.0. And ultimately, it just seems too much of a step back from the Strausler V4. Now, I want to briefly touch on the Tawldy 2, as there seems to be some confusion about this tank, with some sources stating that the big difference from the Tawldy 1 is increased armour. The Tawldy 1 was a very unreliable tank and was built using a lot of imported parts. In order to fix this issue, when producing the second batch of vehicles, the Tawldy 2, as they would become known, used Hungarian-produced parts, including stronger torsion bars for the suspension, allowing it to handle heavier loads, leading to future improvements to weapons and armour being applied solely to the Tawldy 2 variants. I think the confusion comes about from one of these later variants, most likely the Tawldy 2A, which was given a bigger gun but also some small increases in armour. I suppose it's possible that some vehicles were given the additional armour without the improved armament, but I've yet to come across any sources stating this. It also had a simpler antenna mounted on the right side of the turret, instead of the large round variant of the Tawldy 1, aiding in telling the two vehicles apart. Overall, even if it did have the improved armour, I couldn't see this being above Battle Rating 1.0, for the simple reason that it is still armed with the same 20mm anti-tank rifle as the Tawldy 1, which just doesn't cut it for the higher battle ratings, while still barely being protected from return fire. Now, the Hungarians recognised the issues with these earlier Tawldys, and started work to try and rectify the problem. Thankfully for us, the vehicle that resulted from this, the Tawldy 2A, is already in War Thunder, although unfortunately as a Battle Pass vehicle. Going from the stats in game, the Tawldy 2A is armed with the 37/42M 40mm cannon, a much needed improvement from the 20mm anti-tank rifle, giving it a penetration of 60mm at a 0° angle from 500 metres when using the armor-piercing ballistic capped ammunition, though the armor-piercing high explosive ballistic capped will still give you 52mm of penetration at the same range. Armour is also slightly improved, with the gun mantlet armoured to 33mm and the frontal armour improved to between 20 to 23mm, though there are no changes to the lower glacis, which remains at 13mm. Unfortunately, this is the extent of the improved armour. Some vehicles were given skirt armour as well, which could be included as an unlockable attachment. Speed is slightly reduced to 47 km an hour or 25 miles per hour, while the crew size remains free. Overall, the current battle rating of 1.3 seems a fairly good place for it, as its improved gun allows it to take on tougher enemies while being able to take some hits from the front, though the rest of the armour remains at only 13mm, meaning you shouldn't rely on your armour to protect you. Lastly, for the Tawldy series, we have the 43M Tawldy 3, of which only 12 or so were produced, and these don't seem to have seen much if any frontline service. This variant of the Tawldy is still armed with the same 40mm gun as the Tawldy 2A, with the big difference being improved armour, with the frontal armour being improved to 35mm, with some reports of the side and rear being thickened to lesser degrees, perhaps around 20mm. Speed would no doubt be reduced, although I haven't been able to find any exact confirmation of this, while the crew complement is the same as on previous models. With its improved armour and decent gun, I believe the Tawldy 3 should at least be a battle rating of 1.7, though I can see some arguments for 2.0, its main disadvantage now being its low number of crew, with one hit to the turret potentially knocking out the whole tank. Ultimately, this would be a pretty good tank for War Thunder and one of the best light tanks Hungary can field. Moving on from the Hungarian light tanks, we can now start looking at the Hungarian medium tanks, represented in this case by the 40M Turan and its variants. The first of these is the Turan 1, and like with the Tawldy series, this is a Hungarian-produced variant of a foreign design, in this case the T21 or T22, which would then become the 40M Turan. The Turan 1 was armed with a 41M 40mm cannon, firing the same shell as the Hungarian-produced 40mm Bofors. There is some disagreement between sources on penetration, but the sources I'm going with suggest around 64mm at a 30° angle at 100 metres, or 40mm at a 30° angle from 500 metres, which seems mostly reasonable to me. Armour was 8 to 50mm thick, though due to Hungarian industry not being able to create plates of sufficient thickness, it had to use two small plates stuck together for some of the 50mm sections, which would make it worse performing than a single armour plate. Interestingly, the Turan 2 in-game seems to have a mix of single and double plates, so it's possible the Turan 1 would also be implemented in this fashion. As with the Toldi, these tanks were sometimes fitted with armoured skirts of around 5mm. Max speed was 47 km an hour or 29 miles per hour, so not much slower than the Toldis, while the crew complement was 5, a driver and machine gunner in the hull, gunner, loader and commander in the turret. Overall, this seems a decent medium tank, similar to the Panzer IIIF in gun performance while sporting greater armour and a slower speed. Overall, I think a battle rating of around 2.0 would be a good fit for this tank. Next, as with the Toldi 2A, we have a tank that is already in War Thunder, the Turan 2. Similar to the Panzer IV F1, the Turan 2 is armed with a 41M short 75mm howitzer, giving poor penetration with its regular armour-piercing capped ballistic capped ammunition at only 37mm at 500 metres, but it is also able to fire a heat shell with a flat 90mm penetration at all distances at a 0° angle. Armour is much the same as the Turan 1, giving decent protection similar to the Panzer IV F1, though speed is reduced to 44 km or 27 miles per hour. Crew complement is still 5. Overall, its current battle rating of 2.3 would be a good place for it to be introduced to a Hungarian subtree. Moving on to the Turan 3, the first thing you might notice is the rather odd commander position sticking right out of the turret, somewhat like the French-designed SARL-42. This seems to be due to a lack of space in the turret with the addition of the new 43M 75mm long gun, forcing the commander to have to stand, hence the strange design. Despite being a vast improvement on previous models, only one prototype was made. Derived from the German Pak 40, this length 43 75mm gun, despite not being an exact copy, has roughly the same penetration characteristics as the KWK 40/43, so should have about the same stats as the Panzer F2. Its armour was supposed to be 13 to 75mm thick, though while Hungarian industry was now able to make thicker plates, I'm unsure if they could make armour this thick, so it could potentially still need to use bolt-on armour to make up the difference. Spaced armour in the form of armour skirts was also first tested on this tank, before being rolled out to the other Turans. Max speed would again be reduced because of the increased weight, though I've not found any concrete numbers, but I suspect it would be around 40 km an hour or 25 miles per hour. Crew complement would still be 5, though the commander's position is going to make a tempting target for many players. With regards to the battle rating, I believe 3.7 is a good place for the Turan 3, as it has a good gun with thicker armour than previous models, and will thus be able to hold its own against other similar tanks at this battle rating. Now moving on, we come to what will probably be deemed the most controversial tank on this list, the 44M Tars. Now this tank was a Hungarian attempt to build something like the Panther, having been quoted a price for licensed production of the Panther that the Hungarians evidently felt was too high. That said, its whole form does seem to resemble the T-34 in some ways, showing it wasn't a straight copy of the Panther. The tank was intended to be armed with a conversion of an 80mm gun, presumably the 29/38M, both as AA gun already in Hungarian service, though other similar guns were also in development. However, due to delays, it was chosen to fit the Tars with the same 75mm gun as on the Turan 3 and Zrínyi 1. However, there was only 2 of these guns in existence, and they were already being used in the aforementioned vehicles, meaning they would have to wait for another one to be constructed or borrow one from one of the other vehicles, delaying their construction. Work was carried out on 2 prototypes, with one of these being made of mild steel and the other fitted with armour. Construction of 2 prototypes would later cause some to assume one of these prototypes would be a tank destroyer, similar to how the Germans would make tank destroyer versions of their regular tanks. Work was being carried out on the mild steel prototype and was progressing well, with much work done on the hull and construction of the gun and turret ongoing, when Allied bombing destroyed the factory and prototypes held within, though evidently some documentation survived. The gun as mentioned above is the same 75mm as on the Turan 3 and Zrínyi 1, so will have the same performance as on them. Armour would have been a maximum of 120mm, with the minimum being between 20 and 50 depending on the source. However, while Hungarian industry could now produce even thicker plate, I'm unsure if this is the case for this thickness of armour, so it may be a case of 2 plates stuck together, causing them to be weaker than 1 plate. Speed was supposed to be about 45 km an hour or 28 miles per hour, though of course it was never tested for this, and whether its 2 connected Turan engines would be able to achieve this is unknown. Crew complement was the standard 5 as on the Turans. Now it seems somewhat doubtful this tank could be included due to not being finished, but on the off chance it is, I would suggest a battle rating of around 5.0 to 5.3. The reason for it being lower than the starting Panther is that the TARS would have pretty good armour and OK mobility, but would be hobbled by a gun about the equivalent to the KWK Length 43, as used on the Panzer IV F2, which is a 3.3 battle rating vehicle. Ultimately, it would probably go about 5.0, though honestly I don't see a huge chance of it being added into the game. It should also be pointed out that both the Turan 1 and 3 have been found in the game files, while the TARS obviously hasn't, so this suggests that the former vehicles will be added into the game, but that the TARS will probably not be, at least straight away. So, with all of the tanks out of the way, we are left with the tank destroyers, rocket-armed vehicles, and self-propelled anti-aircraft vehicles. Starting with the tank destroyers, we have the Toilde Panzerfahrzeug. In many ways, this seems to have been an attempt by Hungary to produce its own cheap tank destroyers, with converting its existing Toilde 1s seeming to be the objective of the programme, though this didn't work out due to the suspension, weight and reliability issues that the tank suffered from, and so the vehicle was ultimately not put into production. The weapon used for testing appears to be a German 75mm PaK 40/2 taken from Armada 2, though presumably it would have used a Hungarian weapon if the vehicle was deemed successful. However, in-game it would likely retain the German weapon, giving it the same stats as the Marder 2 in-game. Being installed on a Toilde 1 tank, it would have still had the thin 13mm armour for the hull, and probably not much better for the gun shield. It would presumably have been a bit slower than its pre-conversion state, and while the exact crew complement is not known, I would presume around 4. A driver, commander, gunner and loader. This vehicle would probably be added at battle rating 2.3 on account of its powerful gun for long range shooting and decent speed, where its thin armour will not be a problem. Next, we have the Zrínyi series of tank destroyers, the 44M Zrínyi 1 and 43M Zrínyi 2. Paradoxically, we will start with the Zrínyi 2 as this has a 40/43M 105mm howitzer, while the Zrínyi 1 has the same 43M 75mm gun as on the Turan 3 and TARS. The reason for the swap is that, as mentioned earlier, there was not enough 75mm guns, so the Hungarians went ahead with the production of the howitzer version, which is why, despite being the second variant, it has a 1943 designation. I've not been able to find any concrete penetration values for the howitzer, but I have seen the figure of 80mm bandied about for a heat shell, which seems quite low but somewhat plausible, especially as I've not seen what angle it was at. Armour was 8 to 75mm, which is pretty decent armour, especially considering its lower profile. Max speed is 40km/h or 25 miles per hour, and it's served by a crew of 4. A driver, a loader, commander and gunner. I think a battle rating of 2.7, possibly 2.3 would be a good fit for the Zrínyi 2, mostly on account of its armament and possibly having a much weaker heat shell than the equivalent Stur 42, though I might be wrong on those stats. The 44M Zrínyi 1 has somewhat similar stats apart from the 75mm gun, the same as used on the Turan 3 and TARS. This would be placed at 3.7/4.0 as this is somewhat similar to the Stug 3G, though with a slightly weaker gun and armour. As with the Turan 1 and 3, the Zrínyi 1 and 2 have also been found in the game files, again making them an almost certainty for being added. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the Hungarian rocket launcher vehicles that could be included. Thanks to Ulunu for bringing some of these to my attention in the comments of the last video. Now 3 of these vehicles were regular tanks or trucks converted to mount the Hungarian-made 100M 44M Buzóganvető or mace thrower rockets, capable of penetrating up to 300mm of armour. The vehicles used were Hungarian trucks, the Toilde 2 and the Nimrod. For the trucks, the Hungarians used 38M Botond and Krupp Protz trucks, though others may have been used as well, with the rockets being mounted in pairs on the flatbed at the rear of the truck. This gives the trucks a surprisingly heavy punch, allowing them to be used as deadly tank destroyers, and if positioned for a quick escape, they can be used as lethal ambush vehicles. I would suspect a crew complement of 3 to 4 and decent mobility from these vehicles, especially on flat terrain and urban areas. For the Toilde, the main armament appears to have been removed and a pair of rockets mounted over the engine deck behind the turret. From the looks of it, the rockets would either have to fire at a ridiculously high angle or more likely fire at its targets from a side angle, Speed would no doubt be reduced, and I suspect the crew complement would be unchanged. For the Nimrod, the main armament was again removed and 2 rockets mounted in its place. This would have increased speed, as I doubt the 2 rockets would weigh the same as the turret and gun, though crew might be reduced, I suspect to a minimum of 4. With regards to the battle ratings for these vehicles, I would probably place them between 3.0 and 3.7. I know that's quite broad, but honestly, it's all dependent on the rockets and how they perform, as they are the only armament fitted to these vehicles, which could potentially make them vulnerable, as they're their only form of self-defense. But the rockets are so powerful that they're likely to cripple or destroy any vehicle they hit. So, yeah, I'm not really sure on this one. I'd say 3.0 to 3.7, but I can see if others disagree on that. There was also at least one attempt of fitting the 43M 15cm multiple rocket launcher weapon to a Swinny 1. This was termed either a Raketa Sorosavito or just Sorofazetto. This weapon was a Hungarian license-produced Nebelwerfer 41 that I believe fires the same WGR-41 rockets as on the 15cm PZW-42 already in-game as a German premium, which gives them a penetration of 27mm. Choosing a battle rating for this vehicle rather depends on whether it keeps its gun. Without, I would say around 2.3, where it could find some success against weaker vehicles, but its tough armour would be offset against the limited armament. If it's fitted with the gun, it would have to be higher, but of course, it would probably be at such a battle rating that its rockets would be of limited use. Regardless, I would be very happy to see all of these vehicles introduced, especially as they provide a unique insight into lesser explored vehicles and weapons used in World War II. We now move on to the self-propelled anti-aircraft vehicles, of which we have 2. The first of these is the D944 PSZH, also our first and only Cold War Hungarian vehicle. Now this is more akin to an armoured car, but due to its weaker armament, I've chosen to place it here, as in lower tiers it can still cause damage to early tier aircraft and hold its own against lightly armoured vehicles. Armament consists of one 14.5mm KP-VT heavy machine gun, and one coaxial KG-KT 7.62mm machine gun. Now this armament is still capable of dealing with lower tier aircraft, but is also capable of dealing large amounts of damage to ground vehicles, with the armour-piercing incendiary tracer round being capable of penetrating 42mm at 100 metres, making this a dangerous vehicle even outside of the very early battle ratings. Armour is relatively thin, being only a maximum of 14mm. Max speed is 81km an hour or 50 miles per hour, and it has a crew complement of 3, a driver, commander and gunner. Now I had a bit of difficulty on deciding a battle rating for this vehicle. The BTR-152A, which has 2 14.5mm machine guns, is a battle rating of 3.0, which leads me to think a battle rating of 3.0 or very possibly 2.7 would be the best place for it, as it will still be dangerous to aircraft and thinner armoured vehicles, while those with heavier armour will still be protected against it. And finally, we have the 40M Nimrod, a licence-produced variant of the L62 Anti-1. Interestingly, the Hungarians intended to use this vehicle more in a tank destroyer role, but I've chosen to cover it in the self-propelled anti-aircraft section. The Nimrod is armed with a Hungarian Bofors 40mm. The Nimrod and the Turan both use the same ammunition and both have roughly the same penetration characteristics, so roughly around 40mm at 500 metres, making this a decent tank destroyer as well as anti-aircraft gun. It could also mount a large heat shell fitted over the barrel, somewhat like a rifle grenade. This could only be used once, but would give armour penetration of around 180mm, allowing it to deal damage to tanks that would otherwise be invulnerable to it. However, I'm doubtful of this being included for the Nimrod, as this would need reloading externally, and would logically prevent the gun being used in an anti-aircraft role while fitted. Armour is thin, much like the Toylde chassis it's built on, being only 6 to 13mm. Max speed is 50km an hour or 31 miles per hour, and it is served by a crew of 6, a driver, commander, 2 loaders and 2 gunners. I believe a battle rating of around 3.7 to 4.0 would be a good place for the Nimrod, about the same place as the L62 Anti-2, where its gun can do good damage to enemy aircraft, but also to any enemy tanks that might present a good target. So that brings us to the end of this episode looking at Hungarian tanks. As you can see, there are a large amount of interesting and varied Hungarian vehicles that could be added into War Thunder, preferably as a subtree. The fact that at least 4 of these have been data mined gives me some hope for this, as this shows Gaijin has been making some progress towards implementing Hungarian vehicles, though hopefully not as Battle Pass vehicles as with the Toil D2A and the Turan 2. I'd also like to hear your comments on what Hungarian vehicles you are most looking forward to. I personally am looking forward to the Turan 3, though an opportunity to use the V4 light tank or the truck mounted rockets would also make for a lot of fun in my opinion. So I hope you enjoyed the video and hope you will join me for the next one. It will likely be on tanks for either the Netherlands or New Zealand, depending on which one I finish research on first. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.